My next guest is going to talk with us a little bit about Donald Trump's new nominee for HHS Secretary, Health and Human Services Secretary, Alfred. I'm told that Alex Azar actually pronounces his name Azar, rhyming with laser. It's kind of a Midwestern pronunciation, but most people call him Azar or Azar or whatever he is. But whatever you call him, he's a terrible choice to be the senior official in charge of the American healthcare universe. And yet, there we have it. He testified before Congress during the past week. And here to discuss Azar with us now and related topics is Merith Basey. Merith is the executive director of Universities Allied for Essential Medicines. That is, I'm going to have to read it out, the acronym UAEM.org. She has more than a decade of experience in global public health and related skills. She did postgraduate work at in Latin America at La Universidad Complutense. Oh, okay. You know. And also went to the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She has background in a number of health campaigns, and she joins us now. First of all, Merith, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Oh, of course. And Alfred, I keep calling him Alfred. Alex Azar. Okay, he is Trump's nominee, former CEO of the U.S. division of Eli Lilly, so he is a pharmaceutical executive. He is a former pharmaceutical lobbyist, worked for the George Bush II administration. Good choice?
Not a good choice. I think the starting point for this is that I think the HHS secretary needs to be a champion for people and prioritizing people's health and people's lives over corporate interests. And there's nothing that this man has done to show otherwise. And I think for most people, people say, oh, you could give him a chance. But I think a leopard doesn't change his spots overnight. And we've seen this man lead a company that has been a monopoly for insulin over the last really nearly 100 years. And today he has continued up until January when he left to see insulin prices rise in the United States and around the world as a result of his leadership, and people have paid with their lives as a result.
Well, I want to get to that in a second, the cost in human lives as well as in human treasure. Mm-hmm. But so Alex Azar, Eli Lilly, I was trying to think before you came in whether there had ever been a Health and Human Services Secretary. The department had a slightly different name at one point, but whether there had ever been a person in this position who had been an executive, a money maker, and I believe the answer is no. We've had physicians and so on, but
yeah. So I think people have come from academia or politics. But historically, there's never been a corporate CEO of especially not of a pharmaceutical corporation. But yeah, you're accurate.
You know, I guess there is the old saying to, set a thief to catch a thief. But I've seen no indication in Azar's background that he's willing to catch other thieves. Now, people will be listening and saying, well, perhaps it's unfair of me to characterize him as a thief, but I do. Do you think that's unfair?
I don't think it is unfair. I mean, to start with, a lot of public money goes into research at universities, for example, and then corporations like Eli Lilly will leverage that and decide the price of the drugs that were developed with public funding, primarily through taxpayer dollars to the tune of $34 billion every single year, that tends to end up in corporate hands where they're able to put a price on people's lives, essentially.
So let's talk a little bit about Eli Lilly, mm-hmm. Okay? Eli Lilly had a couple big money makers, as I understand it, and it's horrible to talk about life-saving drugs mm-hmm. in those terms, but that's how they talk about it. One of them was Prozac. But I think the big money maker, particularly now, for Eli Lilly is insulin.
Correct.
Right? And you have some background in insulin. So first of all, let's talk about insulin. You know, it's interesting because they make so much money off insulin, and yet it's not a new drug. It's an old drug.
Correct. So insulin was first discovered by Banting and Best, who went on to earn the Nobel Prize for their work. And they had seen much suffering of children specifically with type 1 diabetes, because without insulin you cannot survive. And back in the 1920s, this, much like HIV was in many parts of the world before we had some of the revolutionary drugs, this was a death sentence. And it still can be today if you don't have access to insulin. So when they first discovered this drug in 1921, they realized that this was basically a miracle drug. They decided to license it really just for a nominal sort of symbolic dollar to the University of Toronto, because they believed that this should be a public good and this product would save lives, millions of lives around the world. So that was sort of the vision for insulin in the beginning.
So wait a minute, when they discovered insulin, and by the way, I prefer the use of the word discovered because we're talking about scientific principles rather than invented. So when they discovered insulin in 1922, I think it was, they didn't say, how do we monetize this? They didn't say, we can become millionaires off this?
Absolutely not. Much like sort of the Jonas Salk story with polio, he talks about, would you patent the sun? And that was very much their approach. They wanted this to be a drug that would save lives, having seen what it was like to basically witness young children die slowly and a slow, painful death. Essentially starving without insulin. And so that was an incredible gift to humanity, and yet Eli Lilly was the corporation, although it was a sort of mom and pop shop back in the day, that licensed that drug from the University of Toronto. But those principles around access and affordability and availability was not something that the company has lived up to.
Yeah, so, and again, we're talking with Merith Basey, Executive Director of Universities Allied for Essential Medicines.
Yeah.
Good, I got it. Okay, so we have this drug that was invented for the betterment of humanity, and yet and it was invented almost 100 years ago, 95 years ago. How does Eli Lilly make so much money from it?
Well, there are three companies. Eli Lilly is one of three. There's Sanofi and Novo Nordisk, and they are essentially they monopolize the entire market. 99% of the volume of insulin sales around the world are controlled by these three corporations. And 96%, I think, of all insulin that is sold outside of the US. And yet, 1 in 2 people globally still don't have regular access to this drug. And the life expectancy of some people in other parts of the world who don't have access, nearly 100 years later, it may be a year or less than that, depending where they live. And this is an extraordinary result, given that people talk about how the patent system is about innovation, and then in the end, people will get access to drugs. We know from the story with insulin that is simply not true. The system is set up and designed to profit, and it is not really about prioritizing people's lives in the end. This is really about shareholder value, and this is what we're seeing with Azar. This man who has managed to oversee the price of insulin increase more than 3 times in the last decade. This is something you're going to see from $75, which was already expensive and above the price you would see, say, in Europe, because the US is one of the only developed countries in the world that do not regulate drug prices. And for a man to sort of lead what is supposed to be an organization that is about serving the interests of the American public, this cannot be a person who will be able to deliver on those promises, and cannot be a person who will deliver on lowering drug prices, as the president has suggested that he wants to go hard on.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to recall that there was also some investigation, I'm not sure of the outcome, But I believe there was also some investigation as to whether these three corporations that control the insulin market were not in fact manipulating that market and working together, colluding.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reality is Eli Lilly it's essentially part of a drug cartel, the insulin cartel. And we have seen the data, the evidence suggests this. And people are looking into this now, finally, sort of an antitrust issue, because it is illegal to increase the price of a drug in collusion with another company. And we've seen these price hikes continue consistently, even the same hikes to the same price on the same day. And that is impossible unless you're in collusion with another group.
What are the odds?
Yeah.
And so we're really talking about this guy who was CEO of the American Corporation, the American division of Eli Lilly. I take that to mean he's potentially implicated in illegal behavior. Certainly his corporation is implicated.
Arguably, he should be under criminal investigation and certainly not in one of the most powerful positions overseeing the health of millions of people in the United States.
And I want to get back to what it means to not be able to afford insulin. You know, people in this country for a long, we've had insulin around for so long, and it's been available for so long to most people, and that's been getting harder and harder, as we can talk about that too. But I think people in this country have forgotten what it means to have inadequate or no treatment for diabetes. We're talking about death, we're talking about loss of limbs, right? We're talking about horrific health consequences that are an everyday occurrence for people all around the world, and I believe increasingly so for people in this country, right?
We're seeing things in the United States that you would expect to see in a low-income country, which is shocking in 2017. To see children who don't have regular access, you're going to see things like stunting, you're going to see kidney failure, you might see blindness, and also you can actually die very quickly, as we've seen some young people and older people in this country die. Their cases have been talked about a little bit in the press, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. And I think the reality is, with insulin, people can live a long, normal, healthy life. And when you raise the price of insulin and people are forced to stretch insulin, what it means is they're forcing their bodies to have high sugars, essentially, blood sugar. And this will mean that over time, their kidneys will suffer damage, their retinas, this kind of thing. And so it's a very slow and painful process that is entirely preventable, and people can live normal lives, but they need to have access to insulin to do that. We saw in the results of a study in Atlanta that people who had been stretching their insulin, so 68% of the cases of people arriving to these hospitals had been stretching their insulin. And 1/3 of those people said that it was because they couldn't afford insulin. This should not be happening when we know that the drug costs certainly only a few dollars to make, because it's sold by the very same company in countries like Sweden for $18 a vial, the reimbursement price. So we know that at $18, they're still making a profit. And yet they sell the same thing here for $270.
So Alex Azar, perfectly comfortable with costing human lives.
Yeah.
That's in order to make a buck.
Yeah.
That's my interpretation. Was there anything that you saw in his recent Senate testimony that made you think perhaps he's had a change of heart, or he's become a better human being, or he's seen the error of his ways and now wants to bring people like himself to justice, like a cartoon, like a comic book character or something?
Wouldn't that be nice?
Well, yeah, but did you see any sign of that?
Absolutely not. Senator Warren asked an important question, which was around whether CEOs should be held accountable for sort of presiding over this sort of behavior. And he absolutely would not answer that question. He skirted it, and she took that as a very strong, resounding no. I don't think they should be held accountable. And his behavior, I feel, was very much in line with what we saw with Martin Shkreli, the sort of farmer bro who raised the price of a drug and was in the press a year ago.
Right.
And he ultimately went to prison, but he didn't go to jail because he raised the price on a drug, meaning that people couldn't afford it, by raising it 5,000% overnight because he could. He went to jail for fraud for something else, because apparently if you screw over rich people, you go to jail. But if you screw over people who need access to medicines, nothing happens.
That's a fantastic point. In fact, if you do the latter, you have a very good chance, apparently, of becoming Health and Human Services Secretary in the government of the United States of America. So, all right, I think you've fortified my belief and our belief of a lot of our listeners that this is a drastic choice. And I'll just close with this. You said that these three corporations represent a drug cartel. Mm-hmm. So I want your endorsement for an idea I had recently. I don't know if you saw the article, but the Mexican drug cartels were caught using a cannon. Did you see that story?
No.
They had built a cannon and they were using it to fire drugs that they were smuggling across the border, like a mile, for someone to pick up on the other side. It is creative, and my thought was to create a cannon, create cannons like that, go to Canada, and fire affordable prescription medications to people who need it in the United States. What do you think?
That's certainly a creative idea. I think that it is true that in Canada, a lot of the drugs are much cheaper. They're certainly as safe. I know there's been arguments that, you know, drugs from Europe or Canada wouldn't be as safe, but that's simply not true. In Canada, the drug prices are still high. They could be a lot lower.
Of course. No, that's absolutely true.
But I do think there are so many...
But they're about 40% lower than here, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I can't fire a cannon from France.
That's correct. You can from Mexico and you can from Canada.
All right.
But I do think... there are a lot of solutions. Like, there's a lot of power within the NIH, within HHS, to simply lower drug prices and also attach conditions to new grants for research and development, so that future drugs are more cost effective for the American people.
And they only have patents because we give them patents, and we can take them away.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Merith Basey, head of, now I'm going to have to read it, University's Allied for Essential Medicines. Thanks for your great work in this area. Where can people go to find out more about what you do?
UAEM.org.
Okay. And thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.